Hi, everyone. So today's talk is Christ is Not Divided, Gothic Theologies of Toleration and the Depiction of the Catholic. And it's going to be borrowing from my book, which you can see on screen and right next to my face here. If you're here right now, I'll pop a link in the chat, or I already have done. And if you're watching on YouTube, I will pop one below the video. So if you're interested in the book for yourself, for your library, you can get it. If you want to contact me online, you can find me at RomGothSam on Blue Sky or Twitter, and you can use the hashtag Romancing the Gothic to comment on the lecture, if you would like to. So, what are we talking about today? Well, first, we're going to be talking about the depiction of the Catholic, principally, and it's become a critical commonplace to suggest that the Gothic is anti-Catholic. Hirst, arguing against this to some extent, says that the Gothic is often seen as a means of anti-Catholic expression, a genre which is predominantly, if not exclusively, Protestant, and where anti-Catholicism is a key Gothic ideology, leading to texts being seen as anti-Catholic manuals, and the Catholic Church being depicted as a form of Gothic monster. And so I've zeroed in on the illustration on my front cover here, and this is that representation of this idea of Gothic anti-Catholicism, these monstrous monks persecuting an innocent man. And of course, I'm not going to try and deny that there are elements of anti-Catholicism to the early Gothic. These are quite well documented. The depictions of monstrous monks and other clergy, persecuting institutions, the Gothic obsession with the Inquisition, and of course, the impact of French anti-clerical pornography, which I have another talk about that I have linked below. However, there is a great deal more complexity to the question than a simple kind of monolithic anti-Catholicism. There are a number of discordant notes which challenge these fairly flat anti-Catholic readings. In what sense? Well, or how? Well, as Maria Perv points out, there are some seemingly fairly pro-Catholic novels within the Gothic canon, including texts like The Orphan of the Rhine by Eleanor Sleeth, with a majority Catholic cast, where those outside of the Catholic Church are usually villainous. In a number of texts, we have good institutions, particularly good convents, classically in the Italian by Anne Radcliffe, where two convents are contrasted, the evil San Stefano and the good Santa Maria della Pieta. So not every Catholic institution is depicted as evil or pernicious. There are also good priests, good abbots, good confessors, good mother superiors, and good nuns. And as Mary Muriel Tarr points out, so Sister Mary Muriel Tarr was one of the first to kind of do an in-depth study of the Gothic depiction of Catholicism. And she notes the ways in which Gothic texts often validate Catholic forms of practice and worship, particularly worship, which is often depicted as sublime, and creating a sort of real space of interaction with the divine. In the same way that many of the people engaged in this worship, or the places where they're worshipping, are depicted as places of real piety. The majority of Gothic novels, it's also worth noting, have an entirely Catholic or a predominantly Catholic cast, some of whom are evil and pernicious, others are not. And we'll look at some of the reasons why people discount this later, but I don't think we should discount this in terms of how we're assessing these texts. The next 2 points I'm going to talk about in much more detail later, but I'm going to bring them up now. So one thing is, we see a sort of sense of theological tolerance in a lot of these texts. So in narratives like Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, where there is a question of losing or maintaining your salvation, selling your soul, and therefore using your salvation or keeping it, we often have a range of characters, including Catholic characters, who will not sell their salvation, suggesting that they are, in fact, saved already. So that's an implicit extension of theological tolerance. And we also have some very overt pleas for religious tolerance towards Christian denominations specifically in many Gothic texts. So how do we look at this complexity? How do we investigate it? How do we move beyond sort of the simple description of, oh, the Gothic is anti-Catholic? How do we bring in these more kind of puzzling notes into our analysis? Well, a number of critics have suggested that the Gothic engages in a double movement. So Alison Milbank suggests that the Gothic is predominantly an Anglican genre. Now, certainly not all writers were Anglican or Anglican aligned, but this doesn't invalidate sort of the usefulness of the reading in terms of reflecting on some texts. But she suggests that the Gothic represents a broader anxiety in the Anglican Church about its connection to the Catholic Church. There is this intrinsic link because the Anglican Church arose out of the Catholic Church. It maintained, as we see in the picture here of York Minster, a number of places of worship, and also kept forms of hierarchy, forms of liturgy, etc. And so there is this sort of sense of relationship, which leads to, both in kind of the discourse of the period and in Gothic literature, a double movement of critique and appropriation of the Catholic, i.e. a criticism of Catholicism to explain, well, why did we split from the Church of Rome? And then also a movement of appropriation. So these are the things that we're saving from the Church of Rome. This is where we've kept some things. And we are kind of acknowledging that familial relationship with the Church of Rome. Jarlath Colleen also looks at this within the specific context of Ireland and Irish theopolitics at the end of the 18th century, where he points to the fact that it was the fact of the politically necessary project of an Irish Anglican rapprochement with Irish Catholicism in the face of English government overreach. As I've mentioned, I think that these readings can offer us an insight into the theopolitical and political concerns of certain Gothic novels. However, I do think we need to go further in terms of unpacking the complexity implicit in the depiction of the Catholic in the Gothic and the depiction of other religious groups. I think what we need to do is move away entirely, or not entirely, but we need to move away from a framework which looks at texts and assesses them as either anti-Catholic or pro-Catholic, or a sort of balance of both. One of the reasons for this is I think that the term anti-Catholicism isn't particularly useful. And why? Because, well, what is anti-Catholicism? What do we mean by anti-Catholicism? I would argue that it's an overdetermined word, i.e. there are too many meanings for it, which are sort of not distinguished when we're talking about it. So let me go through some of the possible meanings of anti-Catholicism, or modes of anti-Catholicism. One of these is theological critique. So the critique, for example, of monasticism, the critique of transubstantiation, of penitential theology are common critiques that you'll find. However, this is not necessarily the same as theological intolerance, which refers to the idea of rejecting Catholics as part of the wider body of Christ or the wider church because of their affiliation with Catholicism. Broadly, outside of simply the Catholic context, theological intolerance is the rejection of other creeds and other religious groups or denominations from the fold of the Christian church. We also have political critique. So this is a critique not of the theologies particularly, but of the structures, hierarchies, actions of the church itself, either the church with a small c or the church with a large c. And again, this is not necessarily the same, although it can be aligned with political intolerance or a lack of toleration. So political toleration is the extension of equal rights to all, regardless of religion. It's full freedom of conscience. And political intolerance is the rejection of that freedom of conscience and various degrees of legal measures or punitive measures against people from other denominations. Now, these might combine in different ways. Theological critique does not necessarily indicate theological intolerance. In fact, it's very infrequent that it does. Political critique doesn't necessarily reflect political intolerance, and political critique isn't necessarily accompanied by theological critique. For example, in depictions of monasteries, we'll often find a theological critique of monasticism, celibacy, seclusionism, negative virtue. We'll often see a political critique of structures and hierarchies, but this may be twinned with a notion of theological tolerance in the depiction of, for example, good Catholic characters within that setting. Yeah. So what we find happening in a lot of critical discussion about Gothic texts that use anti-Catholicism as a framework for interpreting the text is that we have these different definitions of anti-Catholicism coming into conflict with each other and often clashing, and also often sort of reducing our ability to engage with the complexity of the text. So let me give you a case study to illustrate this. I'm going to talk about Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, and I'm going to give you a quick summary before we go in for those of you who might not have read it. So there's a frame narrative to this, and the importance of this is going to come up again in a minute. But in the frame narrative, a couple of English visitors go into an Italian church, and they have pointed out to them a murderer who has come for sanctuary to the church. They also are led by the guide, and we are led with them up to a confessional. It's like, this is the confessional, and there was a confession here. And the story of that confession, I'm going to tell you now, and that's the whole novel, basically. But the story of the confession is connected to two young lovers, Elena and Vivaldi. She is of a lower social status than him, and his family is not happy about this connection. Now, there are two particularly meddling elders in their relationship. The monk, the confessor, Schedoni, and Vivaldi's mother, the Marchesa de Vivaldi. So they work together to separate the pair. Now, this goes from using fake ghosts to warn Vivaldi off, to kidnapping Elena and locking her up in a convent, and even putting Vivaldi in the Inquisition. As I already mentioned in this text, there are contrasting convents that go on. The San Stefano is where Elena is locked up, but the La Pieta is a convent that she's been associated with throughout her life. And it is a place not just of refuge, not just of security, but also a place of real piety. And it's where her mother actually ends up in the end. However, there is a negative depiction of a number of Catholic figures, particularly Schedoni, who is associated with deception and hypocrisy, and there is the depiction of a persecuting Inquisition. However, it's not a simple case of anti-Catholicism. The two convents already point to this. There's also a number of positively imagined Catholic characters. Catholic worship and practices are positively imagined with the text, and so it's a little bit more complicated, perhaps. Now, there's a lot of commentary on this book in relation to Catholicism. And they can present us with seemingly kind of conflicting readings of whether this text is anti-Catholic or pro-Catholic and how we interpret Catholicism. So one of the common readings comes from, is represented in the work of Dan Heuveler, but it's in a lot of people's work, which is this idea that Schedoni reflects a political distrust of a meddling and hypocritical Catholic clergy. So I'm just going to focus on the interpretation of Schedoni here to sort of narrow it down so we're not too vast and trying to look at everything. So he represents a sort of negative view of the Catholic Church. And as I've summarized here, in such anti-Catholic readings, Schedoni becomes an allegory of the Catholic Church's rapacity, its claim to allegiance above and beyond the claims of family or nation, its disruption of the family. George Haggerty has a slightly different interpretation where he says that actually what we see in the relationship between Schedoni and the Marchesa is a dangerous connection between patriarchal structures of society and Catholicism. But in both these readings, what you have is an anxiety around the relationship between state and church, and the influence of the Catholic both on the state and on the private lives of individuals. Now, Mariah Purves offers a different reading of the character Schedoni and of the novel, suggesting that there is a pro-Catholic element going on here. She argues that in the period, Catholicism is being rehabilitated and romanticized, and being used to sort of represent Christian piety in a world of unruly emotion and unchecked sensibility in Gothic novels. She suggests that in Schedoni, penance is validated as an instrument of change and reformation. Now, these appear to be offering contrasting readings of the character and of the novel. But if we look a little bit closer, we're seeing where this over-definition of anti-Catholicism is coming into play. Because what Heuveler and Haggerty are offering is a political critique of the structures of the Catholic Church, which is not necessarily an example of political intolerance. And what Purves is offering us is an example or an exploration of theological tolerance. So these two things can actually sit beside each other, potentially. And neither of them necessarily imply either political toleration or intolerance. So I would suggest that what we need to do is kind of move away from this framework of simply anti-Catholic, pro-Catholic, into a more complex rereading of this character and of this novel. Bearing in mind these differentiations between different kind of meanings for anti-Catholicism: political critique, theological tolerance, political toleration. What I think we need to do first of all is start to engage with Scudoni as an individual and not as a metonym or avatar of the Catholic Church. What both Heuveler and Haggerty do in discussing Scudoni is see him as representing the Catholic Church. But of course, there are a number of Catholic figures, some of whom are aligned with him and some of whom are not and oppose him. So I think we need to see him as an individual, somebody who is part of the Catholic Church, who acts for it, but is also acted upon by it. I think that we can keep the understanding that Scudoni represents a broader political critique of issues that are associated with the Catholic Church. But I also think we need to understand how he sort of brings into the text a broader subtext of theological critique. Now, here I'm going to disagree with Purves. I don't agree with her reading of tolerance here in the specific context, because I don't agree with her reading of penitential theology. Sorry, guys, to be clear, I am going to argue that this is a toleration text, but I don't agree with the particular argument that she gives. Because she's arguing that in the Italian, or the Confession of the Black Penitents, penitential theology is shown to be effective. But I don't think this is the case. I do think, however, that it is a core subtext of the novel. There is a concentration on ideas of penitence, and this is illustrated by the title, where we're told, it's the Italian or the Confession of the Black Penitents. It's also highlighted in the framing narrative. But Scudoni's penitential theology does not work. He's renowned for his frequent penances, which people presume are for some hideous crime gnawing upon an awakened conscience. But at the end of his life, he kills an accomplice and then dies with a demoniacal sound of exultation. Now, this is not the end of a repentant, reformed man, is it? Instead, what we see is a contemporary critique of penitential theology coming through. Now, I need to sort of preface all of these kind of comments on theological critique of Catholicism by saying that this is Catholicism critiqued as it exists in the Protestant imaginary. So this is what Protestants think Catholicism is. It's not necessarily Catholic doctrine or belief. But Charles Maturin, who is also another Gothic author, offers us an example of this type of theological critique of penitential theology, which he calls a monstrous doctrine that notoriously substitutes the phrase "do penance" for the "repent ye" of Acts 3:19. In other words, he sees penitential theology, the ability to go to the confessional, receive a sort of set of penances to do, or a broader penitential theology of going through penances in order to, in inverted commas, earn or barter for forgiveness, as he sees it. He's comparing that idea negatively with what he views as true repentance, the repentance, the turning from, the reformation. So he is arguing that these are two completely different sort of conceptions of forgiveness. He's offering, in effect, a critique of an idea of the externalized conscience. So an externalized conscience is a phrase that Victor Sage uses in his critique of the Gothic, which he associates with the confessional. This is a common Protestant critique of Catholicism at the time, that essentially the conscience of people is externalized in the confessional. Our ability to feel guilt or understand the guilt, to weigh and judge our own actions, is externalized. It's put onto somebody else. And then we do penance and we receive forgiveness. Whereas the Protestant sort of emphasis is on an internalized conscience. It's on repentance and reformation. And so what we're finding is a critique of penitential theology, a critique of the externalized conscience, and the idea that for Scudoni, his penitential practice is not only revealed to be fruitless and not effective, But in accordance with Maturin's claims, it's a deadly delusion. So he is not able to repent because he's too busy doing penance. We also find here, I think, a broader critique of ideas of conditional salvation. So within Calvinist theology, salvation and grace are freely given gifts of God, which we can do nothing to earn. And this is sort of the idea of salvation that appears within the 39 Articles of the Church of England at the time. But the de facto theology in the 18th century was slightly more towards a conditional salvation, where an act of faith becomes the condition of salvation. The acceptance of grace becomes the condition for salvation. And you could arguably see Radcliffe as engaging with this broader debate around conditional salvation and arguing against it. Now, this is all quite sort of detailed theological notes here, but the broader point is that we're seeing theological critiques of Catholicism actually pointing towards wider theological critiques. Once we move away from the framework of, oh, this is anti-Catholic, and move towards the framework of, oh, this is a theological critique, it allows us to take that step back and see what else is going on. So let me give you another example. Criticism of monasticism within the Gothic often focuses on 4 key areas. One is a critique of celibacy as unnatural and vitiating and leading you to become kind of a lust-filled monster. Another criticism is of legalism and hypocrisy being associated with monasticism, people joining monasteries for the wrong reasons, continuing in their practice there for the wrong reasons, an emphasis on legalism and rules rather than on internal repentance and piety. More broadly, a focus on the connection between monastic structures and hierarchies with cruelty and the wielding of power. And the one that I'm going to talk about now is the connection of the monastery with negative virtue. So this charge that people go into the monastery, they separate themselves from the world, and so they don't have to face temptation, they don't have to actively be virtuous, they don't have to do anything. Now, once again, guys, I want to point out, this is not my criticism of Catholicism or monasticism, this is the contemporary conception of monasticism and the contemporary critique of it. So let me give you a case study where we see this reflection on negative virtue. This is from The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe. In this story, we have a young heroine, Adeline, and the Lamottes. At the beginning of the novel, she is given to the Lamottes by some ruffians on a stormy heath. And they take her in, and then they're also fleeing from Paris, and they all go and live in this ruined abbey, as you do. The son of the family, Louis Lamotte, at one point wanders with an A around a graveyard attached to the monastery, and he looks at the graves of the monks specifically and wonders whether a life of mere negative virtue deserved an eternal reward. So he is essentially engaging in that critique of monasticism and negative virtue. But this is a broader subtext throughout the whole novel, and this reflection on the monastic graves just sort of is one part of this wider theme, in which seclusionism and passive virtue is critiqued. So there are 3 key older male figures in this book. There is the Marquis de Montault, who is fully evil. He wants to kidnap and rape Adeline. And he believes in sort of a natural law that I can do whatever I want to do. That murder and rape is just, that's fine. That's what I would do if I was an animal, so that's what I'm going to do if I'm a human being. He also uses some racist rhetoric there from the time as well. Then we have the opposite side of the spectrum. We have Leluc, who represents sort of active virtue. He is a vicar, a Savoyard vicar. He is somebody who is dedicated to helping and supporting the poor. And then in the middle of these, we have Lamotte. So Lamotte seems at first, he might be a good guy, right? He helps Adeline, he takes her, he rescues her, he takes it, lets her live with them. But his virtue, we see throughout, is only passive. It's the path of least resistance. Virtue requires activity, and in this text, virtue requires suffering. So Louis Lamotte only takes Adeline with him because it's the easiest thing to do when the ruffians are threatening him. He lets her stay until it becomes inconvenient, and then he helps the Marquis de Montault kidnap her. So this text is engaged in a larger moral and ethical consideration of virtue, and I'm going to say reminiscences because my brain won't give me the word, but the reminiscences about virtue and monasticism are simply part of that wider theological critique. So I've suggested that what we find in the Gothic is depictions of the Catholic being connected to broader critique. So who then are we critiquing? I'm going to give you two answers to this. The first answer is enthusiastic dissent. What's enthusiastic dissent, Sam? Well, dissent refers to churches that are outside the state church in the English context, so outside the Church of England. That can include Presbyterians in England, not in Scotland where that's the national church, but Presbyterians, Methodists, Quakers, Unitarians, you name it, any group that is outside of the Church of England. Enthusiastic dissent refers to a particular sort of form of dissent often associated with Methodism. So enthusiastic dissent is connected to ideas of personal revelation, emotion, and sort of is also connected with field preaching. It's connected with sort of radical changes in behavior. At the time, it's also kind of starting to be associated with the idea of being indwelt by the Spirit, etc. And what we find at the time, as Robert Miles suggests, is that the Catholic body in the Gothic is often the shadow of enthusiastical Protestantism. So in other words, the Catholic can be a stand-in or simply a reflection of critiques that also apply to enthusiastical Protestantism. And I've picked this Hogarth picture, Enthusiasm Delineated, here as a really clear example of this visually. I won't go into all of the details because there's far too many, but these are all related to different forms of dissent or miracle claims, different religious groups, but the figure at the top is the most important. This is a minister, a Methodist minister with his wig, but what is below his Methodist wig? Well, it's a Catholic tonsure. And this idea of Methodism being a sort of new Catholicism, subject to the same critiques, was a massive sort of discussion in the 18th century. It's illustrated by George Lavington in his massive 3-volume Enthusiasm of Methodists and Papists Compared, where he argues that the Methodists are simply like the early Catholic Church. They work in the same way. So he argues that both of them, and enthusiastic dissent now, is a composition of enthusiasm, superstition, and imposture. It's worth noting here that he's using enthusiasm, superstition, and imposture to refer to types of religious activity. We often think about the Gothic and presume that superstition is code for Catholicism, and it is often Catholic coded, but it is not restricted to Catholicism, and you'll see it used quite widely in the 18th century to refer to a type of practice that is associated with the Catholic Church, but far from exclusively. So what do we mean by superstition, enthusiasm, and imposture? Well, he tells us superstition is religion scared out of its senses, an authority, sort of a hierarchy of authority that tells you what to believe, and you believe it in part out of the fear that is produced by, for example, an imaginary around hell. Enthusiasm, is religion run mad. This belief in personal revelation that God is talking to you and you're changing everything because of these beliefs. You're changing what you think of as the sort of structures of Christianity. And then imposture, fairly obviously, is religion turned hypocrite. So what we see happening in George Lavington here, and to some extent in this Hogarth image, is a focus on critiques of enthusiasm, superstition, and imposture, which are associated with the Catholic Church, but not confined to it. And therefore, when we depict the Catholic Church, we might also be depicting a reflection of these critiques on other religious groups. Now you might be thinking, but does that really happen in the Gothic? Yes, it does. Let me give you a very obvious example of this happening. In The Libertines, which is an anonymously authored text from 1798. Now, some of you know this. I've done a reading of it, which you can find on YouTube. And The Libertines, the main evil character is a guy called Father Jerome. And whatever happens, it's always Father Jerome. He's often in disguise. He's usually murdering people or committing a variety of other crimes. At one point, he has this sort of mini kind of repentance. He leaves the Catholic Church and his position of power and authority, and he becomes a field preacher. Now, field preaching was associated with dissent, particularly enthusiastic dissent, and specifically Methodism. He becomes a field preacher, but this is not depicted as a moment of repentance. Instead, he simply starts to repeat the same patterns as he enacted as a Catholic priest. He's not going out and murdering anyone yet, but he is conning people. He is coercing people. He is forcing his beliefs onto people through fear. So we see sort of very overtly there and very obviously this idea of Catholicism being a broader critique, the depiction of Catholicism offering a broader critique of enthusiasm, superstition, and imposture, which can be applied to dissenting Protestantism. And also, I'm going to argue in a second, the Anglican Church. So the second answer I have to who are we critiquing is the Church of England. Now, this is another sort of satirical print that we've got here of a priest-ridden village with a load of priests riding the backs of people. And you can see that there's very clear associations here with lust, along with a range of other crimes. Now, it's a critical commonplace that the Gothic uses historical and geographical distancing to confront issues safely. It sets things in the past, it sets things far away, but then it confronts contemporary issues nearer to home. And in doing so, it exposes concerns about the self through the lens of alterity. It uses the other to reflect concerns about ourselves. And although not all texts are written by Anglicans, we are seeing this idea that the Catholic Church is not simply other, but a complex foil which cues us into some of the 18th century sources of internal Protestant British unease, and also specifically unease within the Church of England itself. It's worth noting here that there is a long-standing tradition in the 18th century of coding your broader critique of the Church and/or Christianity through using terms associated with Catholicism, such as superstition or priestcraft, and this occurred in the work of freethinkers, deists, reformers, atheists, many people. So this is a long-standing practice. I think the clearest example of how this works is in the Gothic's interest in the Inquisition. So in the Inquisition, I'm going to argue, we're seeing not simply a critique of Catholicism. Now, the Inquisition appears in many texts. The example that I'm going to be using today is William Godwin's St. Leon, where you don't really need to know most of the story. It's a guy who has the elixir of life. The Catholic Church doesn't like that, and they keep him in the Inquisition for 20 years. While there, we have this kind of lengthy denunciation of the Inquisition, where St. Leon denounces a mockery of a trial and gives a range of standard critiques. So he comments on the problem of the anonymity of the accusation, the fact that there's no clear charge, that the question is manipulative, that they use torture, that there are quite often base agents that are feigning sympathy that come to your cell and pretend to be fellow prisoners to get you to give a false confession. And he also points to the inefficiency of mortifying the flesh, i.e. torture does not work. Some critics, or quite a lot of critics, have interpreted this as being a critique of Catholicism, not just in the work of Godwin, but more broadly. So Heubeler suggests that it's a specifically Catholic legal, religious and political injustices, which contrasted the British legal system with an earlier tyrannical, corrupt and ecclesiastical one. And Milbank and Heuveler both suggest that this interest in the Inquisition is a reflection of Protestant memory of the Marian persecution, so Queen Mary's persecutions in the 16th century of Protestants. Now, unfortunately, I don't agree with either of these readings for a number of reasons. But one of those reasons is the fact that oppression and persecution was not limited to the Marian persecutions. There had been religious persecution up into the 18th century, legal in most cases. So there were a lot of legal limits on the activity of Catholics and dissenters. but also in some cases more overtly punitive. I also think, as I'm going to suggest, that what we see is a critique not of a system that is differentiated from the British one, but that is being used to critique the British system of justice. So, I've mentioned this history. So what is the actual situation that we're looking at? Well, there were many dissenting persecutions. So the Act of Tolerance in 1689 doesn't actually lead to complete tolerance. Acts like the Test and Corporations Acts continue to disadvantage Catholics, Quakers, Unitarians, Methodists in a range of different ways. There were also periods of more active persecution. And what we're finding in texts like William Godwin's St. Leon is actually an echo of dissenting rhetoric against sort of religious persecution, rather than simply an anti-Catholic rhetoric. So I'm going to illustrate this here with a quick reading from the Presbyterian John Howe's response to Bishop Thomas Harlow in the face of oppression and persecution, and compare that with a section of St. Leon. So in the John Howe response, he says to the bishop, you claim that all this rigor that you show is from love, and that you are for destroying the dissenters only to mend their understanding. He also says that you're saying afflicto dat intellectum, that suffering brings understanding, but he rejects these claims. So we see a very similar discussion happening in St. Leon, where the inquisitor is saying the breast of an inquisitor was accessible to no sentiment but that of love. A burning love of God, love of the church, love of the prisoner, love of the penitent, love even of the incorrigible heretic, whose body he burned for the good of his soul. So we're seeing the exact same arguments come up in both of those texts. The reason why I chose William Godwin's St. Leon is that it makes it very overt that this is a critique not simply of the Catholic Church. St. Leon himself says, even if this Inquisition ends, even if we stop the Catholic Inquisition, men shall learn over again to persecute each other for conscience sake. Other Anabaptists or levelers shall furnish pretexts for new persecutions, the other dissenting groups. Other inquisitors shall arise in the most enlightened tracts of Europe. And you can basically see him looking at you through the page going, it's you, I'm talking about you, the most enlightened tracts of Europe. And he's referring to the particular legal situation of the time, the removal of habeas corpus, for example. And one of his other novels, Caleb Williams, is a novel all about how corrupt the justice system is. He also goes beyond this and says, what's the real problem here? Well, the problem here is the relationship between church and state. Why had Providence thought proper to generate an alliance between church and state and to place the powers and authority of human society in the hands of the adherents of the Christian faith? That's the problem, he's suggesting. So what we're finding in these texts, and I think it's clearest with the Inquisition, not only in Godwin, but in a range of writers who are perhaps less overt than Godwin in stating these facts, but you're seeing the Inquisition being used in similar ways. But what we're finding is that anti-Catholic stereotypes are being resurrected and adapted for the times, used to critique other things. And as Joan Passy notes, the Gothic, through these depictions of the Inquisitions, but also more broadly, explores an anxiety over the relationship between church and state. So in the first half of this talk, what I've tried to do is move us a little bit beyond the existing frameworks of interpretation that focus on anti-Catholicism versus pro-Catholicism. I've suggested that we need to break down our understanding of what anti-Catholicism means and differentiate between theological and political critiques and theological and political intolerance and a lack of toleration. The second part, I'm going to suggest a different way of framing our discussions about the Gothic. And the sort of framework that I'm going to use is toleration and the toleration debates of the period. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of how I got to this conclusion. So how did I start thinking about toleration as a lens through which to investigate the Gothic? Well, one of the key texts for me was Melmoth the Wanderer. This is often seen as an anti-Catholic manual in which the Catholic Church is a monster. Those quotes from one of my earlier slides, those are about Melmoth the Wanderer. But I would suggest there is something else going on here as well. So the premise of the book is a man who he bargained with the devil, got 150 extra years to live, and then spends the rest of those 150 years trying to get somebody to swap with him. He usually brings his victims to the point of despair and then offers them the same deal that he had, and all of them refuse. All of them choose their own soul's salvation above the chance to escape earthly torments. And Maturin tells us that the idea for this romance or novel was actually taken from one of his sermons, and he gives us the quote from the sermon. He says, "At this point, is there one of us present, however we may have departed from the Lord, disobeyed his will, and disregarded his word? Is there one of us who would at this moment accept all that man could bestow or earth afford, to resign the hope of his salvation?" I think that last line is quite important. To resign the hope of your salvation, you have to have a hope of salvation. And so implicit in this idea is an idea of theological tolerance. And it's notable that in the novel, Melmoth's victims come from a range of different denominations. We have the German Protestant Walbergs, aligned broadly with Lutheranism. We have the non-conforming and Anglican Eleanor, who comes from both a Puritan family and an Anglican family, high Anglican family. We have Emily/Isadora, who is quasi-pagan and quasi-Catholic. And we have the very overtly Catholic Monthada. All of these refuse the deal and keep their soul and their salvation, which implies an inherent idea of theological tolerance. In terms of how tolerance is addressed within the text, we can look to Eleanor's comments, and Eleanor is one of the most positively depicted characters in the novel. And she says we have to balancing the opposite extremes. And here she's thinking about her Anglican family versus her Puritan family. Balancing the opposite extremes she was destined to witness, she came to the right conclusion. There must be good on both sides, nor could she conceive that these clear and mighty spirits would be forever opposed to each other in their future destinations. So this is an advocation of theological tolerance, arguably, potentially the basis for a theopolitical toleration. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. So although very clearly Melmoth the Wanderer offers a critique of theological and political critiques of Catholicism, it also very explicitly extends tolerance, theological tolerance. The other thing that really grabbed my attention and made me think of toleration as a frame is the fact that there are lots and lots and lots of Gothic texts, when you start looking for them, that actually give little toleration speeches in them. So "Be tolerant" is a line from a play called Benoni by Matthew Lewis, and that is the shouted last line of the play. Another novel by Maturin, The Albigenses, which talks about the Albigensian Crusade and is talking about an Albigensian character and a Catholic character. The narrator says, "May those of different faiths, like them, imitate their tolerance and embrace their example." In Lewis's Benoni, we have the good priest saying, "We should scorn to bow beneath the force of vulgar prejudice." Sorry, Benoni says this. "And fold to our hearts as brethren in one large embrace, men of all ranks, all faiths, and all professions." It's again a very overt plea for theological tolerance. In Charles Lucas's The Castle of St. Donats, we have a similar plea. Charles Lucas was an Anglican minister. Just for sort of context, the person who's about to say this has been living in a well for 20 years, but, he says, "Though I was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith, since I came to the years of mature judgment, I have made profession of none other but the Christian." Now, if you stop there, you could read that as anti-Catholic, where he's saying, oh, Catholics aren't Christians, and I changed denomination. But that's not what he's saying at all. He says, "I abhor all separating names of sectaries and distinction. I am neither of Paul or Apollos or of Cephas, but Christ." So that's a biblical quotation, that line. And then he goes on to sort of put this in the contemporary context. He says, "Luther or Calvin, Wesley or Priestley, Papist, Protestant or Dissenter are nothing to me." So what he's rejecting is this kind of sectarianism rather than any particular branch of Christianity. Just so that if you're not sort of as familiar with the theology, Luther or Calvin, sort of key early Protestant theologians. Wesley is founder of Methodism, Priestley of Unitarianism. Papist is the contemporary term that was often used about Catholics. So if we're going to look at toleration as a framework, we need to understand the context for toleration at the time. The critical commonplace in discussing this period in Gothic criticism and Gothic literature is this idea that this was a period of increasingly hostile Protestant-Catholic relations. We see this in the work of Sage and Heuveler. They point to the importance of the Gordon riots as an index of public opinion, but you might notice from the date why that could possibly be a problem. 1780, so that's 10 years before the real rise of the Gothic in the 1790s, when we get the kind of Gothic boom, and, you know, a good 40 years before the end of the Gothic. So how much of an indication can the Gordon riots be? Why should we see them as a beginning when we don't have similar riots later on that kind of scale? They also point to the fact that there was kind of a fear of the Catholic Church as a political entity because of the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, the United Irishmen in the 1790s, and the more broader sort of idea of Catholicism as a civil threat. However, I want to suggest we look at the period differently, and we look at it through sort of the focus of history and church history of the period. So the wider context for this period was actually of widening support for Catholic emancipation. There is a really notable overlap between the rise of the Gothic and the period of sort of that led to Catholic emancipation. The rise of the Gothic overlaps quite well with the fall of the Bastille and the start of the French Revolution. The relevance of that will become clear in a second. And it sort of its tail end is towards the time when we have the Catholic emancipation in 1829. So there's a really kind of conspicuous overlap there in increasing toleration. Also, I want to suggest that we need to look at the broader toleration debate that moves beyond simply seeing toleration as related to Catholicism and applies it or understands it in relation to dissent as well. So let's have a look first at this idea of Catholic emancipation and attitudes towards the Catholic in the period. So Catholic emancipation and the move towards Catholic emancipation was impacted quite significantly by the French Revolution in a number of ways. There was an influx of Catholics fleeing the revolution, and although this led in some places to tensions, it also led more broadly, or it paved the way for the demystification of popery. Newton argues that the behaviour of the clergy, together with the sight of so many of them about the London streets, did much to break down prejudice as well as familiarise the public with Catholic services. And public opinion became increasingly in favour of emancipation. There are various sort of arguments connected with this as well. So Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France offers a defence of Catholicism in some ways, and emphasises the sanctity and supremacy of adhering to the religious traditions of one's forefathers, i.e., sort of noting and respecting that connection of the Anglican to the Catholic Church. What we have happening is the idea that the cause of the Catholic Church, persecuted within the French Revolution, was then identified with all churches. So there's been some, so if you read Heuveler particularly, she'll point to the 1793 Aliens Act and the fear of spreading Jacobinism to suggest that there was still this kind of virulent anti-Catholicism. But it's worth noting that the Aliens Act, which kind of cut down on the number of refugees that were accepted, was connected to the fear of a spreading Jacobinism, which was explicitly understood as anti-Catholic. So Augustin Barrel's memoirs illustrating the anti-Christian conspiracy from 1798 says that Jacobins are a threat because they're against Christianity without distinction of worship, whether Protestant or Catholic. So this is the context, and then what we have during the period is successive Catholic relief acts, terminating in 1829 with Catholic emancipation. So toleration was a sort of strong debate in the period. The fact that we didn't have toleration earlier is actually connected to Protestant dissent rather than Catholicism in many ways. So in the 1790s, pushes towards toleration was struck down because of the fear of radical politics in dissenting groups rather than among Catholics. So that leads us into this idea of the wider context for toleration. Now, Heuveler and Sage point to the importance of the Gordon riots as an indicator of public feeling, and I'm going to do a similar comparison. 1791, we have the Birmingham riots, but the Birmingham riots are specifically anti-Unitarian and anti-Joseph Priestley. So this kind of gives an idea of the sort of violence of public feeling, or the potential violence of public feeling around not only Catholicism but also dissent. And it's worth noticing that although some acts targeted Catholics for sort of in kind of cutting down their legal rights or for punitive measures, there were also a number of acts which specifically targeted dissenters. The 5 Mile Act and the Conventicle Act were to stop them preaching. The Blasphemy Act made the denial of Trinity a crime, and the Testing Corporations Act affected everybody outside of the Anglican Church. So I've quoted myself here because I say it quite well, I think. It's also worth noting that the various arguments concerning political toleration, church-state relations, and theological tolerance had since the 17th century actually been a discussion predominantly carried out in relation to and between different Protestant denominations. And so it cannot be reduced to the political or theopolitical expediency of Catholic emancipation or repression. Indeed, during the time, there was an increasing interdenominational temper with ecumenical movements, collaborations in dissenting colleges, and pro-toleration societies, all leading up to the removal of the Test and Corporations Act. And you might note that the date there is only 1 year earlier than Catholic emancipation. So these toleration journeys are happening together during this period. The debate around toleration often was connected to the idea of a confessional state, or that close relationship between church and state, where they're essentially two parts of one unit. So we've got the context for tolerance and toleration. What do I mean, though, by toleration? What would toleration look like as a framework? Well, I don't want to make the same mistake as we have with anti-Catholicism, where we have a kind of over-defined term. I want to break down the different forms of toleration here. So there's theological tolerance. And so this is where we do not limit salvation to a specific creed or group. And Charles Maturin's, ironically enough, 5 sermons on the errors of the Roman Catholic Church are a great example of this. So this, as the name implies, offers virulent political and theological critiques of Catholicism, but he argues not against Catholics, but against Catholicism, not against individuals, but against abstract opinions. He says that the true church is an aggregate of all who worship God in spirit and in truth under whatever denomination. And he objects to the Catholic Church specifically because it claims to be the one true church, because it is an excluding church and a persecuting church. So theological tolerance, as we've already seen, is quite commonly advocated in different Gothic texts. Theopolitical toleration is where we have a theologically framed argument for the extension or repression of toleration, and it's often linked to theological tolerance as a precondition of toleration, i.e. you only get theopolitical toleration, so the removal of those limits on civil rights only happens when you have sort of theological tolerance underlining it. So a good example of this is in John Locke's letter concerning toleration. And yes, this is from the 17th century, but it was a key text for toleration supporters throughout the 18th century as well. He argues that toleration is the duty of the true Christian, but his limits are defined by the limits of his theological tolerance, because he does not extend that to either atheists or Catholics, who he views as outside of that toleration. The last group, and this we find occurring particularly among Unitarians and among sort of rational dissenters, is political toleration, which is the argument for the extension of political rights, which is based wholly on civil rather than theological foundations. So Anna Barbauld is a good example of this. In her address to the opposers of the repeal of the Corporation and Test Act, she says, "We wish to bury every name of distinction in the common appellation of citizen." Now, any of these might appear in Gothic texts, but I want to suggest that the dominant thing that we see is an interest in theopolitical toleration, which depends upon theological tolerance. The theological tolerance is often more overt, but there is a suggestion, therefore, of theopolitical toleration in many texts. All of these quotes, I think, point to a similar thing. These are all examples of theological tolerance, but they're also related to specific examples of political toleration. In the Albigenses, it's sort of speaking out against the Albigensian crusade. In Lewis's Venoni, the speaker goes on to join another monastery. So this isn't advocating for the sort of the ruin of the Catholic Church at all. So thinking about texts, how do we identify toleration discourse? How do we use this as a framework? What are we looking for? Well, there's all sorts of different ways. You can look at the individual texts and the individual quotations as we find here, which will give you a particular insight into the ideas of toleration which are present in that text. But there are two sort of key theorists that I think are really helpful in thinking about how do we spot tolerance and toleration debates. Irene Bostrom, right back in 1960, argues that pro-toleration texts in this period balance their characters quite obviously. So any side will have good and bad people in it, and there will be good people on both sides, essentially. What's key to this approach is viewing individuals as members of those churches, but not as metonyms for them or as avatars of them. So we see them as acted upon by theologies, incorporated into power structures, but also reflecting broader critiques or values. So they might be part of a political or theological critique of that particular church, but they might also, as we explored, represent or allow us to explore broader theological or political critiques, which sort of escape the boundaries of critique of Catholicism. Mark Canwell suggests that in a lot of texts, more obviously negative texts, we have a complex double movement occurring. He suggests that in lots of these texts, we have, monstrous monks or horrifying inquisitions. The Gothic exposes what it deems to be a terrifying logic of confessional government, i.e., a very close relationship between church and state. And then assumed, precisely as a remedy to the anxieties about Catholicism it generated, a more tolerant relation to religious belief. So it's critiquing the Inquisition, for example, because it represents a confessional state, a state which has a state church, and where the state church is rigorously involved with the politics. That's the problem. And it's also a persecuting church which rejects anyone outside of it. So if that's the problem, when we get rid of that, we actually have to offer tolerance in return, he's suggesting. We have to offer a more tolerant approach to religious belief. We at least are extending theological tolerance in many cases. So does this actually play out in the novels? I'm going to argue that it does. And we can see it very clearly in Benoni, which is a drama, by the way. It's a story of Benoni and Josepha, two young people who are persecuted for their civil goods by a member of the church. This includes imprisonment, this includes being starved, etc. All the sort of usual things that you would expect in a tale of monastic depravity. The evil monk is Father Celestino, but there's also a good Father Michael who tries to save them. So you're seeing Irene Bostrom's thing acting out here, where you have good and evil within the same institution. So we've been forced to differentiate the individual from the institution here. The play ends on the last line, "Be tolerant," shouted at the audience. And we have two speeches about tolerance from different characters. So Father Michael first says to Benoni, "Forbear, my lord, nor brand a whole profession with disgrace, because some few of its professors have been faulty. 'Tis not the habit, but the heart. 'Tis not the name he bears, but the principles he has imbibed, which make man the blessing or reproach of human nature." So, in other words, this is very clearly a plea for theological tolerance. It's not the habit, it's not the denomination, it's the heart. It's not the name he bears, Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Priestley. It's the principles he has imbibed. This is also the root of a theopolitical toleration that is being suggested here, because as I say, he moves on to live in another monastery. This is a suggestion that there is a possibility of things working differently somewhere else. And we finish with this last quote from Benoni, where he says, "Yeah, you're right. I should scorn to bow beneath the force of vulgar prejudice and fold to our hearts as brethren in one large embrace men of all ranks, all faiths, and all professions." So a very clear advocation of theological tolerance there, at least. And what we find in this play, which has been concerned throughout its time with these kind of acts of depravity, it finishes with this plea for toleration, and it can seem like a very strange juxtaposition to our modern eyes. But this message of tolerance is conversely consistent with the depiction of a persecuting Catholicism. Because it's not simply Catholicism which is being critiqued, it's this persecuting church. And so when we get rid of that persecuting church, when we get rid of Father Celestino, that doesn't mean getting rid of the church. It means changing it, and it means rejecting that model of church-state relationship. The last thing I want to do is also differentiate between two forms of toleration, two kind of models of how toleration would work in practice. So there's comprehension, which means the absorption of different theological views and practices into the same church. And I've done a beautiful illustration for you here of a big blue circle, which is the Church of England, and all these other little circles inside it. I.e., this is a kind of broad church idea, that we can have one church, a state church in this case, in which we will find numerous kind of different practices and beliefs. There's space within that to allow for different ideas and beliefs. The best example of that today is the Unitarian Church, where there is no real set beliefs. And you'll find people from all different backgrounds outside of Christianity as well coming together. Toleration, sort of the specific toleration as compared to comprehension, is the radical right to freedom of conscience disassociated from any state control, manifesting in a pluralist state. So I've illustrated it here. The Church of England is smaller because it's not absorbed everything else, and each group is allowed to worship freely. And there's no sort of attempt to state control. There's no prohibitions. There's no punitive measures against these different religious groups. So these are two options. Now, I would argue that often the Gothic is broadly interested in toleration and not necessarily differentiating between these two. But we will find quite often an incipient sort of emphasis on comprehension in a number of Anglican writers. And I think this is particularly true of Anne Radcliffe. So I'm going to finish with a case study that takes us back to our first case study of the Italian. And I mentioned before the two convents, the good convent, La Pieta, and the bad convent, San Stefano. So there's been lots of different suggested solutions to how we're meant to interpret La Pieta, which is just a good convent with good people in it. There's piety, there's holiness, it's all good, really. Hoyviller suggests that convents portray the threat and continuing lure of Catholicism as a political institution and the vigilance needed to escape its siren song. Now, I agree with Hoyviller in some cases. In The Mysteries of Udolpho, for example, Emily states, it was a beautiful illusion that made me want to join the convent as a young woman, specifically. But actually, I want to live a life of active virtue outside of the church. But this is not what happens in the Italian at all. There is no rejection of the monastery at the convent at any point. It's seen as being the best place for Elena's mother, Olivia, at the end. And it is seen as being a place of refuge and of real piety. So this criticism I don't think particularly works. The more common one is this idea that the good convent is good because of its superior, who is an honorary Protestant, i.e. this is essentially actually being depicted as a Protestant institution. Again, I'm going to disagree with that, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about why. So this is the description of the Mother Superior and how she runs this convent. So in her lectures to the nuns, she seldom touched upon points of faith, but explained and enforced the moral duties. Her religion was neither gloomy nor bigoted, and she conformed to the customs of the Roman Church without supposing a faith in all of them to be necessary to salvation. So how do we interpret this? Well, one way that has been suggested is to view this as sort of basically a de facto Anglican latitudinarianism. So Anglican latitudinarianism rose up in the 17th century. It was a response to sort of the religious turmoil of the Civil War, and it was a focus not on kind of theological esoterica, but on a moral life and on natural theology, that which we can know through reason. And it still had significant kind of impact in the 18th century. So should we see this as Anglican latitudinarianism? Well, it could fit, but, we do see that this is specifically associated with the Roman Church. So, but is she a Protestantized figure, really? Is this an essentially Protestant point of view? I don't particularly think so. There is a tendency to assume the uniquely Protestant nature of concepts of providence, sentimentality, tolerance, etc. in the Gothic or in Gothic criticism, but this simply isn't the case. All of the points that we see here could refer simply to a tolerant Catholicism. And it's notable that many people within this convent and more broadly engage in Catholic practices both willingly and fervently. Worship is seen as a point of access to the divine, and their piety is very much real and active and useful in lots of different ways. So as Mary Muriel Tarn notes, Catholic practices in this specific text even offer sublime emotions, comfort, and transcendence. So I think we should view this as an example of tolerant Catholicism. But why am I even talking about this? I'm meant to be talking about comprehension and toleration. What does it matter? How does this relate to those two things? Well, I would argue that by showing us this form of tolerant Catholicism, Catholicism understood as the state religion, it's offering us an example of comprehension or a model of comprehension where everything is absorbed into the one church, but where there is more freedom of conscience and freedom of practice within that larger church than we might perhaps expect. So this, you see it in the Italian, and it might seem a little bit tenuous, but then you start to see the pattern across her work in many different places. And we see this repetition, this emphasis on church authority coming through in a lot of her works, actually. So, a recap. What do we mean by anti-Catholicism? Well, I've suggested we need to think about how it splits into theological critique, theological tolerance, political critique, and political toleration, and how we can use these subcategories to more kind of complexly engage with the texts themselves and understand what's happening in the text, and particularly in terms of critique, outside of simply limiting that critique to the Catholic Church. I've suggested that we use toleration instead as a different framework for approaching and interpreting texts, and differentiated between theological tolerance, theopolitical toleration, and political toleration, suggesting that in the Gothic, we often find theological tolerance, and this is sometimes linked to a project of theopolitical toleration. There are many manifestations of toleration in literature, including these overt sort of declamations, but also the mixed characters, as Irene Bostrom suggests, good and bad, a differentiation between individual and institution, and also that double movement that Canwell outlines. We also find different models of tolerance being explored, and I think this is a sort of a good starting point for much more in-depth exploration of what's going on in these texts. How do we differentiate between the models of tolerance? What do we see in terms of the ideal church and state structure as it's represented in these texts? So hopefully, guys, that has been a useful discussion and has given you some new ways of approaching Gothic texts. I've left a picture of my book, and I have it here, just to remind you that I go into a lot more detail with a lot more examples in my first chapter here, if you found it interesting. I'm going to stop recording.